Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you enjoy these types of videos, consider subscribing. It would mean so much to me. So first off, I really wanted to say thank you to each and every one of you who likes these videos and leaves awesome comments. Even when you guys leave comments for suggestions, I really appreciate it. It's honestly making me so happy and I'm super grateful to you guys. I'm fairly new here. I've only been doing true crime for around 4 months and I'm really enjoying it and enjoying this little community that we're building. You know, we all have a lot going on in our lives and we all have our personal issues. So it's nice to be able to come here and just escape for a little while and just connect with you guys. So I just wanted to thank you guys so much and let's get into today's video. So today we're actually going to be talking about a serial killer couple. Actually, one of the most famous serial killer couples, Fred and Rosemary West. And those of you from England have probably heard about this case before already. And this is a pretty sick case and I'm warning you guys now. And it's also probably going to be pretty long, so grab a snackaroo and let's dive into who Fred and Rosemary were. So I'd actually kind of seen this case like floating around the internet like years ago. And I don't know if this makes sense, but you know when you like look at photos of like true crime things and the photos of this just kind of didn't look interesting to me. It kind of looked like set back way in the day and I was like, meh, how interesting can this be? But holy moly. So let's begin talking about who Fred was and what his childhood was like. So Fred was born on 29 September 1941 in the small town of Much Marcle in Herefordshire, and he was the second of 6 children of Walter West and Daisy Hill. And by Fred's own account, you know, sexual abuse of various kinds was common in his household. He claimed his father had relationships with all his daughters, and his father also taught him about bestiality with pigs and sheeps. Now, if you guys don't know what bestiality is, just Google it real quick, but don't delve deep into it because I made that mistake years ago and I'm still traumatized, so letting you know. So it's also suspected that Fred's mother, Daisy, actually began abusing Fred when he was 12, but he has never admitted to this and it's never been confirmed like these stories about his father have been confirmed. It's been said that when Fred was 13, his mother actually asked him to come into her bed and he ended up losing his virginity to her. So that's where this case is going. Fred also claimed that he engaged in incest, you know, with his sisters and even impregnated one of his sisters. So Fred's father, Walter, was known to be a horrible man. He was abusive, he was a con man, he stole from people and basically taught his son Fred, you know, you can do whatever you want as long as you just don't get caught, you know, just do whatever you want, don't get caught. Walter would actually abuse women in front of Fred and basically teach him that he wasn't a man if he had the opportunity to treat a woman badly and he chose not to. What it seems like to me is kind of like if there was a woman in front of Fred, vulnerable, and he didn't take that opportunity to abuse her, his father was like, what are you thinking, son? She's right here. She's here for you. You just got to take this chance, do what you got to do. Do you know what I mean? Like imagine being raised by a person like that. And when I was researching this case, looking at baby photos of Fred, it's kind of like he was only a little baby. He was innocent. But then when you're raised by a person like this, how else are you supposed to turn out? Like, how do you teach a child stuff like this? It's so sick. Like, I don't get it. What are the effects of teaching this to a child? They grow up believing that this behavior is normal. Bestiality, sleeping with your siblings, abusing people, like that's normal to them now. It's like if you were Fred's friend, you're like, what'd you do today, Fred? Nothing much, Gary. Just had sex with my pet pig. What about you? The world is so messed up and has been for a very long time. So regardless of his relationship with his father, his horrible relationship, and then I guess his twisted relationship with his mother, Fred and his mother Daisy actually were very close. When he was physically punished by his parents for doing badly in school. So although Fred didn't actually do that well in school in terms of grades, he was pretty good at like artwork and woodwork. So when he was punished in school for doing badly, you know, at his subjects, at like English, for example, his mother, who was obese and she always dressed kind of like unattractively. She would often go to a school and like yell at the teachers for yelling at Fred. Fred left school at the age of 15, even though he was basically illiterate, and he ended up getting a job as a farmhand. And when Fred was 16, his looks began improving and he became more attractive to girls. At the age of 17, he was actually involved in a really bad motorcycle accident, and that actually put him in a coma for a week. And he also ended up having an operation where he had to have a metal plate in his head, and he broke his leg so badly that as they were healing, one was like permanently shorter than the other. And I mean, if you need, a metal plate in your head, it's pretty clear that you probably also had a brain injury, and that was true with Fred. He suffered from a traumatic brain injury, and after the accident, he actually developed a really bad temper, and he would often have like violent outbursts of anger. Now, it's also been known that a lot of serial killers, once they've been studied, it's been found that a lot of them have had traumatic brain injuries. It kind of just like mushed their brains up. 2 years later, Fred actually suffered from another brain injury when he was basically putting his hand up this girl's skirt, and she pushed him down, like pushed him off her, but they were on a fire escape. So she ends up pushing him and he ends up falling down the fire escape and hurt his head again. When Fred was 19, he was convicted of molesting his 13-year-old sister, but he didn't actually serve any jail time because his sister didn't testify against him. And his doctor actually said he suffered from epileptic fits. So somehow he got off on that. And after this incident, he was sent to live with his other sister. And at that time, he was basically disowned from his family. But what does this show you? Yet again, Fred gets away with this kind of behavior. He's gotten away with it a few times now. And especially doing things to his sisters growing up. I mean, he got away with it because his father believed that that was okay. So fast forward, Fred ended up actually getting a job in construction, but he was fired soon after that because he was caught stealing. And now one thing to mention when I was doing my research is that Fred was known to be like a nasty ass. He never brushed his teeth. He never took a shower. He never groomed himself. His breath was apparently on fire the whole time, and I can imagine that is. So when Fred was 21, his family finally decided to forgive him and they let him move back into their home in Muchmarkle. And when he moved back to this town, he ended up resuming a relationship with an ex-girlfriend. Her name was Catherine Rena Costello. And Catherine had actually been a petty theft when they first began dating, but she had now since moved on to prostitution. So when he ended up reconnecting with Catherine, she was actually already pregnant from one of her clients, and she was pregnant with a Pakistani man's child. But Fred and her decided to, go ahead and get married, and they kept the child. But in order to explain why the baby was, half Asian, Fred and Rena decided to write to her parents and say that the baby that Rena had actually been pregnant with had died during childbirth. So they ended up adopting a child, this half Asian child, and they ended up naming this girl Charmaine Carroll. So biologically it was actually Catherine Renner's child, but she wanted to explain away the mixed ethnicity of the child, so she just said the child was adopted. So they married in November, and it was only 2 months after they ended up reconnecting, and they ended up moving to Scotland together. Now, Fred demanded sex from Rena every single day, all the time, and he wasn't interested in just like regular sex. The couple ended up having a child of their own in July 1964, a daughter, and they named her Anne-Marie. And during their marriage, Fred worked as an ice cream truck driver, a job that, gave him access to multiple young women. And friends would say that Rena was a very considerate mother, and Fred would actually treat their family very harshly. He actually kept his 2 daughters in a bunk bed with bars actually fitted between the 2 beds, which was basically like a cage. And he would keep them in there all the time. And only let them out when he was working. So they also had a nanny named Issa McNeil, and through this nanny they met Anne McFall, who was 16 years old, and she basically ended up spending a lot of time with Fred and Rena at their house because Anne's boyfriend had actually died in a workplace accident and she was super depressed about it. So she just ended up spending like a lot of time with their family, which is just so random. So throughout the course of their marriage, Fred actually had a ton of affairs with many women, and he actually ended up having a child with one of the women he was having an affair with. When Rena discovered this, instead of being like, what the hell, I'm going to leave him, she was kind of just like, okay, I'm just going to have an affair with someone too. So she ended up having an affair with a man named John McLaughlin. And one time, Fred actually caught the two like hugging, and it was obvious that they were having an affair. So he ended up punching Rena in that moment. And then in response, John punched Fred. And then Fred ends up drawing a knife and then like scratches John's abdomen. But John ended up punching Fred like a second time. And then Fred retreated, like he backed off. Years later, John recollected this moment and said, you know, Fred was super slow in wanting to attack men. But with women, he had no problem. He was so happy to just go ahead and punch them or kick them. He wasn't afraid. John and Rena actually continued their affair for a while, but every time he would see her, she would have, you know, like new bruises or black eyes, and he was so shocked by this. And every time John realized that Fred had beaten his wife, John would then go ahead and beat Fred. This to me is such a strange situation. Like, John, if you loved Rena, why not just tell her to leave Fred? Like, why have an affair and let her just keep getting beat up by Fred? It's like John had power over Fred. If he could keep beating him, clearly Fred was maybe afraid of him. Another time, John actually witnessed Fred with Charmaine, that was the first daughter, the half Pakistani one, when she was little older than a toddler, and she asked Fred for ice cream from his van. And in response, he struck Charmaine over the head because she asked him for ice cream. And what did John do? He beat Fred. So this strange life of theirs finally came to an end in Scotland when John accidentally ran over a 4-year-old boy with his ice cream truck. Even though apparently the accident wasn't Fred's fault, he moved his entire family together with their nanny, Issa, and that girl, that 16-year-old girl, Anna, who was living with them. He moved them all to Gloucestershire, where he ended up getting a job at a slaughterhouse. When Fred and Rena's marriage finally collapsed, Rena ended up moving back to Scotland, but she came back in July of 1966 because she missed her daughters. And when she came back, she discovered that Fred had actually begun a relationship with 16-year-old Anne. In 1967, Anne actually became pregnant with Fred's child, and she actually tried to get Fred to divorce Rena. And Fred at first tried to hide his relationship with Anne from Rena, but then Anne suddenly disappeared. It's alleged that Fred, in response of Anne asking, him to divorce Rena, killed Anne and, chopped her up and buried her body and also removed her baby from her body. So that's pretty sick. Rena actually ended up leaving Fred a few months later, and she also left her 2 daughters with Fred. But Rena always regretted leaving her children with Fred. And even though she was extremely scared of Fred, she ended up, working up the courage to ask Fred for custody of the 2 children. And that was the last time that Rena was ever seen or heard from. It wasn't until 21 years later, in 1994, that Rena's body parts were found separated head to toe in a forest, buried. Fred is suspected to have killed again in January of 1968 when 15-year-old Mary Basthome disappeared from a bus stop. And after the death of Fred's mother in February of 1968, Fred began committing a lot of petty thefts and actually changed jobs a lot. It was during one of these jobs as a bakery truck driver that Fred would meet his future wife and accomplice, Rosemary Letts. So let's talk a little bit about Rosemary. Rosemary Letts was born in Devon, England on November 29th, 1953. Her household was also troubled and abusive. Her father, Bill Letts, was a schizophrenic who constantly disciplined her, her siblings, and her mother, Daisy. Isn't it weird that both Fred and Rosemary's mother's names are Daisy, and then they were both born on the 29th days? So while Daisy had been pregnant with Rosemary, she had received electroconvulsive therapy as treatment for her severe depression. And it's like where they put, those wires in your head and they shock you to induce seizures to provide treatment for mental illnesses. Obviously, this cannot be good for a growing baby in your belly, and it was clear that this affected Rosemary. Rosemary, as a baby, would rock back and forth in her crib for hours. But again, who's leaving their child in their crib rocking back and forth for hours? Like, how do they know these things? And Rosemary would also bang her head on walls. She had developmental delays, and her mother would actually call her Dozy Rosie. Alrighty then. Clearly, Rosemary was not okay. She had brain damage. She couldn't tell right from wrong. She didn't show any signs of empathy, guilt, or compassion for others. Exactly like Freddie. Growing up, Rosemary was abused by her father, like Fred. Her mother, Daisy's depression just made Daisy check out. She wasn't involved or there for her family. This blush, I have applied 20 layers, and Rosemary didn't have anyone to turn to. And because she wasn't very bright and she was kind of overweight, she was often teased at school and responded to her bullies by attacking them very aggressively. When she was a teenager, she became more sexually active, and she was even caught getting into bed with one of her brothers, her younger brother, and was caught fondling him. According to Rosemary, because she was overweight and her father prevented her from dating boys, her own age, Rosemary began pursuing relationships with older men in the area where she lived, and one of them even took advantage of her vulnerability and ended up raping her. When Rosemary was 15, her mother, Daisy, finally, had enough of the life that she was living and had enough of her father's abuse, and took Rosemary and went to live with one of her older daughters and her husband. During this time, Rosemary ended up spending even more time with male companions. And Rosemary grew up, pretty similar to Fred, similar in the sense of they just both grew up with messed up mindsets of what life should be. Rosemary grew up, using sex as a tool to get things that she wanted from people, especially from her father. They just had a sick, twisted relationship. And it's almost like you love your abuser so much that you're willing to put up with the abuse, almost like you crave it, the attention that it brings. Later that same year that she moved out of her father's home and moved in with her mother and her older sister, she ended up actually moving back in with her father. And not long after that, she ended up meeting Fred West, who was 12 years older than her. Rosemary at the time was only 15 years old when she met Fred, and she wasn't interested in him because, like I mentioned before, he was a nasty ass. He stank. But apparently this guy was super charming, and she ended up falling in love with Fred. Fred spun a whole lot of crap to Rosemary. He would tell her that his wife left him and he was stuck, raising these two children, and he was lonely and he wanted to have more children with, a new woman, the new love of his life. He basically convinced Rosemary to come and live with him as a nanny for his two children. In spite of their sick, twisted relationship and the way he treated Rosemary, Rosemary's father, Bill, strongly objected to Rosemary and Fred's relationship. And he even ended up going to the trailer where Fred was living with his two daughters and threatened him to, stay away from Rosemary. Now, during this period, there was a whole bunch of incidents that took place. where social services was called, and then Fred's kids were taken to social services, and then Rosemary's parents had social services take Rosemary into care because she was only 15 and they didn't want her in a relationship with Fred. And then while this was happening, Fred was in jail for several offenses for not paying fines, and during this period, Rosemary actually became pregnant with Fred's child. And she actually agreed with her parents, like, okay, look, yeah, I need to leave Fred and I need to get rid of this baby. But then at the last minute, Rosemary changed her mind and she gave birth to a baby girl named Heather in 1970. And then she ended up moving in with Fred. Like, this whole ordeal with social services and telling her parents that she was gonna, not do exactly what she ended up doing. Do you know what I mean? But then when Rosemary gave birth to the baby, Fred ended up going back to jail for another offense. And Rosemary was, now at home with 3 children, taking care of them at the age of 17 years old. Now, like I mentioned before, Rosemary was also all kinds of messed up. And because of her temper problems and, resentment about caring for children that weren't even hers, she often treated Fred's kids, Anne and Charmaine, really badly. Charmaine, the eldest daughter of Fred, didn't really react to Rosemary's punishments the way that Rosemary wanted her to. She, wouldn't cry, she wouldn't get upset, and Rose was like, for real? You're not upset by this? So then she ended up trying to hurt her even more. Like, what a sicko. So in the summer of 1971, Rose ended up taking the 3 children to go visit Fred in prison. And when they got back from the visit, Rose apparently completely snapped and she killed Charmaine while Fred was still in prison. She stored Charmaine's body in a coal cellar until Fred was released from prison. And, I guess he would then help her take care of this. So after severing Charmaine's fingers and toes, Fred ended up burying Charmaine's body beneath the kitchen floor. And by the way, when I was doing research about this, I did not find anywhere that stated that Fred, was upset about the death of his daughter. He was a sicko too. And being that Charmaine wasn't biologically his, he was probably just like, whatevs. You guys, look how purple this eyeshadow looks when I'm like using like all these red shades over here. Like, hello. Looking for red, not purple. Okay, I'm back from blending. Does it look a bit more red? Not really. Okay, so Fred and Rosemary ended up getting married on January 29th, 1972. But although they were now married, Fred actually encouraged Rosemary to sleep with other men, both for, money, prostitution, and for fun. And he often watched Rosemary through a peephole. He also took like erotic photos of Rosemary and posted them in swinger magazines. And these were mainly used as their ads for Rosemary's prostitution. In June of 1972, they ended up giving birth to their first daughter, and they named her Mae West. And, in order to make room for their thriving family business, they ended up moving to 25 Cromwell Street, where they carried out multiple assaults and murders. Rosemary continued working as a prostitute from their home at Cromwell Street, and they even created like a special room for Rosemary that was fitted out with all types of contraptions, bondage stuff, ropes, and there was like multiple peepholes for Fred to use and watch Rosemary, as well as a red light that was installed on the outside of the room door that would, warn the children, don't enter right now because mommy's busy. And this room was called Rose's room. So over the following years, Rose actually ended up giving birth to 7 more children, 3 of which were fathered by Fred, another 3 who were of mixed race and, fathered from her clients. And it is suspected that another may have actually been fathered by, and are you guys ready? One of the kids may have been fathered by Rosemary's own father. Okay, that's pretty bad. But the reason why this happened is because Them two, Rosemary and her father, kept engaging in their incestual relationship even after she gave birth to like her fourth child. And, you know, he didn't like Rosemary being with Fred, but he was like, oh, me and Rosemary, yeah, we can keep doing what we're doing. I mean, but her and Fred, no, but her and I, yeah. Her father became one of her regular clients and would visit her often in Rose's room. I'm telling you guys, this is a sick case. In October of 1972, Fred and Rosemary actually hired a young woman named Caroline Owens to work for them as, you know, their nanny. They kept making multiple sexual advances towards her, and of each of which she just declined. And on one night in December, after they both unsuccessfully tried to seduce her, she tried to leave the home only to be held captive by Fred and Rosemary. When Fred threatened Caroline that he would let some of his friends, you know, have her, and he even threatened to kill her, Caroline ended up just complying with all their requests. Demands, not requests. And the next day, surprisingly, they released Caroline. So Caroline, upon being released, goes to the police and lets them know what happened. But surprisingly, like all of, you know, Fred's past experiences with the police, he was able to convince the police that whatever him and Rosemary had done to Caroline was completely consensual, and they ended up just getting fined like $50 for indecent assault. Over the next 6 years, they killed at least 8 women who had, you know, made their way to 25 Cromwell Street as lodgers or, you know, employees for the family. The first was Linda Guff, a seamstress who knew the Wests personally. The next was Carol Ann Cooper, who disappeared walking home from a movie theater. In December, Lucy Partington disappeared on her way home back from a Christmas event. She was murdered by Fred and Rosemary, who held her captive over Christmas and the New Year period. They abused her, raped her, tortured her, and then eventually killed her. On January 3rd, into the new year, Fred was actually treated at hospital for a laceration on his body that was most probably from trying to get rid of Lucy's body. From 1974 to 1979, 5 more women, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Robinson, who was actually 8 months pregnant at the time of her death with Fred's child, and Allison Chambers all met the same fate and were killed by Fred and Rosemary. It's unknown if they had, you know, committed more crimes, more murders, and if they did, which they probably did, they probably, you know, buried the bodies not on their own property at 25 Cromwell Street. And it's also known that they actually committed more crimes against women, but they released some of these women too. The Wests definitely had a type. All of their victims were Caucasian females in their mid-teens to early 20s, and sometimes some of them were even related to them. The ones who weren't related to them were usually lured under the impression of, you know, being nannies or working for the family. Their MO, while these women were in their control, they would torture them, rape them, do like sadistic bondage acts on them for days, and then eventually strangle or suffocate them, and then bury them under their family property at 25 Cromwell Street. Rosemary was actually known to enjoy this behavior and enjoy these acts with women. And the more pain she could inflict on them, the more that they would beg for sort of mercy, the more she enjoyed it. So that was what Rosemary liked. She liked the fear and the pain that she was causing her victims. Fred's signature was cutting off fingers and toes and like kneecaps. A lot of his victims were found without kneecaps, and it was later discovered through forensics that this was done post-death. So he really enjoyed this for some reason. But by the way, who's taking care of their 20 million children while they're doing all this? Like, first of all, being a parent is hard enough. How the hell did they have time to do all this stuff? Like, getting rid of a body, cleaning all that up, like, that takes hours, doesn't it? Like, getting rid of all the evidence. Who's taking care of their children? But apparently they were super strict with their kids, and they would make them do chores from like the age of 7, and they would beat their kids if they didn't follow orders. Between 1972 and 1992, their children were admitted to the emergency room over 31 times, and no one followed up as to why this was happening. Like, kids being kids, just bumping their heads and getting their kneecaps bashed maybe, who knows. While committing all these crimes, as if that wasn't enough, Fred was also abusing his daughter Anne, the daughter that he had with Rena. And Anne actually ended up becoming pregnant with her father's baby, but that pregnancy had to be terminated because it ended up occurring in her fallopian tube, which turned out to be an ectopic pregnancy. Anne ended up having to go to the hospital for this, and once she was released from the hospital, Rose ended up beating her so severely because I guess she got pregnant. Who knows? This is so sick. Anne ended up running away in 1979, and when Anne was gone, he switched his attention to his other daughter, Heather, the one that he actually conceived with Rose. But I've also read articles that state that Heather could have actually been Rose's child with her father. But again, that wasn't enough. They also ended up abusing their other daughter, Mae West. And Fred's logic was like, I made you. I can do whatever I like with you. I created you. Heather, Mae, and their younger brother, Stephen, were actually very close in age and also just very close with each other. And because they were so close, they actually came up with like a little pact with each other that if any member of the trio was ever asked to be alone in a room with their father, Fred, that one other person from that trio would kind of always make sure they were there too, so that Fred wouldn't do anything to Heather or Mae. Both girls also ended up developing a routine where either of them would only take a shower or get undressed if the other would sort of stand at the door and keep guard. Stephen was also informed by his father that, when he turned 17 years old, he was going to have to lose his virginity to his mother. And this only confirms the sort of implication that this happened to Fred. So the fact that he was asking his son to do this, in my eyes, it confirms that this, did happen to him. Heather would actually go to her mother and complain about the abuse that she was receiving from her father, Fred, but Rose would just laugh at her distress. I don't know how people like this even exist in the world. Fred would dispose of his victims first by, burying them underneath the house, but then he moved on to underneath the garden or underneath the garage. And to cover up all these burials that were taking place in his house, he just pretended that he was doing multiple home renovations and, he was just a busy guy. And in order to, afford the supplies that it took to cover up these crimes, he would just steal everything. And because he stole so much, he was always under the police radar, but for some reason, all his killings just kind of went unnoticed. The couple came super close to being exposed in 1986 when Heather actually went and told one of her friends about the abuse that she was suffering. But in the following year of June of 1987, Fred and Rose actually silenced their daughter by strangling her. She was then picked apart and buried in their garden. But in May of 1992, the Wests were finally exposed because Fred videotaped himself abusing one of his daughters. And when she told one of her friends, the friends ended up telling the police, and the investigating officer at the time, Hazel Savage, had actually heard of Fred when he was still married to Rena. And when another girl who was assaulted by Fred came forward to the police ended up obtaining a search warrant for the West's home. In August of 1992, they searched the West home for any evidence of child abuse. And when Rose was actually questioned about where Heather was, her daughter, she was like, I don't know, don't ask me. How am I supposed to know where she is? So for some reason at the time, the home just wasn't searched. Fred was arrested for rape and sodomy of a minor, and Rose was arrested as his accomplice. And while they were, under police custody, the kids were taken into social services. While Fred was in custody of the police, Rose actually became depressed and attempted suicide. But she was, I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, saved by one of her sons. And definitely unfortunately, the rape case against Fred fell apart when one of the victims backed out and no longer wanted to testify. She was just really scared and decided that she just, wanted nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, Hazel, the detective, became super suspicious about the Wests and the disappearance of Heather, and the fact that when the West children were interviewed, it was just strange. Everything was strange about the whole situation, because the West children, when they were interviewed, told Hazel, like, I don't want to talk about anything because my father is just going to go ahead and bury me like he did Heather under the back garden. And when Fred was questioned about this, he was like, oh my God, are you crazy? How are you so silly? You're going to believe the children's wild stories about me? So on 25th February 1994, Hazel was able to obtain another search warrant to have the entire property dug up based on what the children had, said about Heather being buried in the backyard. At this point, Fred was like, well, I'm done for. So he grabs his oldest son and he has a conversation with him. He tells him, look, I messed up. I've done a lot of bad shit. Go to the newspaper, tell them all about my life, all about my story, and make a ton of money this way. But take care of your mom in the process. Then, while in custody, Fred ends up confessing to Heather's murder. And at this time, the police, is digging up the West home, the property at Cromwell Street. And at this time, he was only suspected of Heather's disappearance. But when they were digging up the property, like, multiple bones just started popping up here and there, which the police had no idea about, no explanation for. They knew now that Fred was a serial killer. Fred then confessed to all the murders, and he said that he did this alone in order to protect Rosemary. However, he would not admit to assaulting and raping any of the women. He stated that all of them wanted to sleep with him, every single one of them. Soon enough, the bodies of Anne McFall, that was the original nanny, and Charmaine West, the first child of Fred's with Rena, turned up as well, and then they were able to identify the bodies. And at this point, the police was like, holy crap, this guy is crazy. So they ended up taking Rose because they believed that she was in danger. Her life was in danger. So they ended up putting her into a safe house, and Rose agreed. She, cut off all contact from Fred. She said she was really afraid and she was protecting herself. The police ended up recording everything that Rosemary said, and she said some crazy stuff. She just started claiming that, she was brainwashed and Fred was supposed to be a good guy. He was supposed to treat her well. He was, the one who was supposed to save her, take care of her. Fred initially said that he committed all these murders on a whim, but forensic evidence actually showed a lot of restraints, sticky adhesive tape, which a lot of the victims had wrapped around their head and mouths, knives, and a lot of the women had actually been severely tortured prior to their deaths. So this showed that clearly he had intent to hurt, and it was premeditated as opposed to just like random, accidents or killings. On December 13th, 1994, Fred was charged with 12 counts of murders, but police believed that there were way more. Fred was claiming that the spirits of his victims were actually haunting him. So the police ended up using this against him, saying that, okay, look, the spirits of the victims that were found, their, spirits are gone now because we found them. They're gone. Together with their bodies, they're gone. But the bodies that are still haunted, these spirits are going to haunt you forever. So you better tell us where they are, because this can help you. This can relieve, your stress. So they gave him a can of red spray paint, and he goes around and ends up marking all the areas where he buried victims. All those 8 women I mentioned earlier were found buried all over the place, underneath the house, all over the yard, and 6 of these 8 women were missing kneecaps. There were a total of 12 bodies found, including those 8 women I mentioned earlier, and then the other bodies were Heather, Charmaine, Anne, and Rena. During this whole process, Rose was so mad at Fred, and when they would attend court together, she would just refuse any of his attempts at contact and would just ignore him. This made Fred furious, and then he eventually was like, nah, I'm done protecting you. Here we go. Let me just tell the truth. And he ended up recanting all of his previous confessions, where he confessed that he committed all these murders on his own. And he was like, no, Rose was also involved too. Go get that hoe. How gorgeous is this lip color, guys? So not something I would do, but I love it. If you guys want to check out this lip combo in action, go ahead to my Instagram. I will post a reel, I think, on what I used To achieve this, it's at the ZARA V on Instagram. Okay, so on 13th December 1994, Fred was charged with 12 counts of murder and taken into custody at Winston Green Prison. During this time, Fred became super depressed and completely lost his mind. And due to this, on New Year's Day 1995, Fred hung himself and took his own life with a knotted bedsheet. He never made it to trial. However, he did leave a little suicide note with a little gravestone with his name on it. And in this note, he also proclaimed his love for Rosemary. And he wrote, "Until we meet again." His body was cremated and no one attended his funeral except for 5 of his children. In the end, Rose was also put on trial, first for the rape of an 11-year-old girl, and then for an assault of an 8-year-old boy in the 1970s. She was taken to Pucklechurch Maximum Security Prison and questioned on all the murders that Fred, had committed, but in particular about Heather, their daughter, and Linda Guff. And then on April 25th, 1995, she was charged for the murder of Linda Guff as well. Rose never confessed to any of the murders, and a lot of the evidence against her was mainly circumstantial, but there was an important witness named Janet Leach. She was Fred's social worker, and before Fred had died, he had actually told her that Rose had been involved in all the murders and had even killed Charmaine, their daughter, and Shirley Robinson, all on her own. On November 22, 1995, Rose was found guilty of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison. She will never be released. To this day, she still maintains her innocence, and she's made various appeals over the years. But in 2001, she was like, okay, I'm not going to try and appeal my conviction anymore. She just decided that she's just going to live with it. Well, she better. The West's home on 25 Cromwell Street was known as the House of Horrors and was torn down in October of 1996. They never rebuilt a home on it. In its place now is like a pathway that leads to the town center. All of the West's surviving children ended up getting completely new identities. I mean, for sure, 100% I would ask for this because I want nothing to do with my parents if they're as sick as this. So this case really got into my head because I think this case is one of the cases that I've researched that has so much information about every little thing that Rose and Fred had done to their victims. And when you're researching this, you kind of almost feel like you get to know each of the victims and their circumstances as to how they came across Fred and Rose. I definitely read up on all of that, and throughout my research, I just felt like I was a fly on the wall in the West's home, and I could envision everything that they were doing, and I just felt so sick. This one was a sick case. They committed such sick crimes, and sometimes I feel like we sit here and we talk about it, and we almost don't realize or forget that this is real life. These things really happened to real people. And when I catch myself realizing that, I'm just like, whoa. Imagining what every victim had been through, and not only that, but Fred and Rose, the way that they were raised, their upbringing, it must have been really hard for them. I know what they did was horrible, but I mean, the way that they were raised, was there a chance that they were going to turn out any better? Imagine what the West children's lives were like every single day. They must have been fully aware of how sick their parents were and the sick things that they were doing, and they will never ever recover from this. Okay, you guys, let me know your thoughts on this case below. Have you heard of it before? I'm really glad I actually ended up researching it because I feel like I had been seeing it, but I'd just been putting it off for all this time. And these guys definitely go down in history as one type of couple you don't want to be. I hope you guys enjoyed this case, and I hope you liked how this makeup look turns out. It's so wintry, completely the opposite to what our weather is in Australia right now. We're definitely leading up into summer. I can't wait to see you in my next video, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.